My name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. The ink has barely dried on the Paris Agreement, adopted by 195 nations on December 12th at the 21st Conference of the Parties, otherwise known as COP21, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The world's first universal climate pact has already been hailed as historic and a landmark. It is, at the very least, a diplomatic triumph of the highest order. But it will be years before we can begin to measure its impact, and maybe even longer before we know if it is the deal that set the world on the path to climate salvation, or if it was the deal that was too little, too late. But we can still attempt a preliminary assessment. Having covered the COP from opening bell to closing hammer, I will also make some observations on how some of the more than 3,000 journalists credentialed to cover it went about their job. 6 years in the making, more than 20 if one starts the clock with the Rio Earth Summit, the Paris Agreement has laid the foundation for a global push to beat back the existential threat of global warming. It broke new ground in at least 5 significant areas. For the first time, nearly every nation on the planet, from oil exporters to post-industrial economies to rapidly emerging giants to countries mired in poverty, has committed to curbing its heat-trapping greenhouse gases. Even North Korea signed on, vowing to, quote-unquote, declare war on deforestation. Second point, having already decided in 2010 to cap global warming at 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels, the newly harmonious family of nations opted in Paris for even greater ambition, well below 2 degrees, with a promise to pursue efforts to limit the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Third point, because their voluntary carbon-cutting commitments, when tallied, fall far short of the new target, or the old one for that matter, nations have also agreed to revisit their pledges every 5 years. The hope is that new technologies backed by money will give countries the confidence and the incentive to speed up the transition from dirty to clean energy. Point number 4. To help ensure that promises are kept, the Paris Agreement lays out rules and procedures for verifying each country's efforts. While there are no penalties for non-compliance, the system provides a common yardstick for progress and applies name-and-shame pressure for adherence. And finally, the New Deal details for the first time a pledge made at the chaotic 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit to mobilize $100 billion per year for developing countries from 2020. The hard numbers have been relegated to a legally non-binding preamble so that the Obama administration can do an end run around a Republican-run U.S. Congress. But poor countries can now reasonably expect that amount to increase over time, and that roughly half the money will go towards helping them prepare for climate impacts already in the pipeline, both hard-won concessions. Victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan, John F. Kennedy once said. The United States, France, and China have each taken credit for the outcome of COP21, as did Green campaigner Bill McKibben on behalf of millions of grassroots activists around the globe. India could likewise lay claim to the laurel simply for not blocking the deal despite its deep misgivings. A share of the credit should also go to the large cadre of political and policy experts working at various points along a spectrum of advocacy ranging from business-backed think tanks to hardcore green groups and champions of the poor. Any journalist covering this story who says he or she didn't rely to some extent on their knowledge and insights is probably not telling the truth. Since this series is addressed primarily to journalists, allow me to tell a story that says something about how our team at AFP went about the task of covering COP21. In the tense hiatus between the release of the final draft and the 195-nation plenary meeting that would either bury or embrace it, journalists scrambled to collect reactions. We still did not know if the Paris Agreement would be adopted. As 20-odd journalists in the AFP team worked the phones in our cramped, coffee-stained cubbyhole, in walked Alden Meyer of the Washington-based Union of Concerned Scientists, a highly respected policy workshop. Alden has been to every annual UN climate meeting since the inaugural COP in 1995, as well as most of the technical meetings in between. He's one of our top go-to guys when we need a quick answer or an insightful analysis, and I have spoken to him countless times over the last 8 years. As soon as I saw his face, I somehow knew that the Paris Agreement was going to be adopted. He didn't say that, of course. His words, as always, were measured. "It looks good," he said. We peppered him with questions about which countries might object to which provisions in the text. But what gave it away was his radiant expression, a mix of excitement, satisfaction, and relief. I had never seen it in him before. Having watched Alden strain to remain upbeat through nearly a decade of impasse and setbacks, and knowing what it would take to satisfy him, to suddenly see him genuinely happy made me think, maybe there's a good reason to cheer. You can't, of course, go to the bank or write a lead based on a hunch. But just then, my colleague Mariette Leroux rushed in. "I've got the LMDCs on record saying they're on board," she blurted out. That would be the Like-Minded Developing Countries Group, one of the several formal negotiating blocs under the UNFCCC umbrella, which counts among its members virtually all of the countries that might have torpedoed the agreement, including India, China, and Saudi Arabia. "Well then, it's a done deal," said Alden without missing a beat, before turning on his heels and walking out of our mini newsroom so that Mariette could storify, as we say, her scoop. The Paris Agreement was more than a diplomatic coup for France. For one thing, in the words of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, it restored the global community's faith that we can accomplish things multilaterally. That confidence had been nearly shattered by the debacle in Copenhagen. More fundamentally, it keeps alive the hope that humanity can rise to the challenge of replacing, in a few short decades, the very engine that powers civilization. But what happened in Le Bourget is only a first step, a collective letter of intent, if you will. Now comes the hard part, one measured in numbers: gigatons of greenhouse gases, degrees Celsius, deadlines, ocean pH, parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. For unless we find a way to stay within our carbon budget, the rapidly dwindling lump sum of CO2 we can put in the atmosphere without overshooting the 2-degree target, much less the 1.5-degree one, then the Paris Agreement may ultimately be remembered as the deal that came 20 years too late. For months, France seized every opportunity to contrast their handling of the COP21 with the ill-fated 2009 summit in the Danish capital. And it is true that the Paris conference was as well organized as the other was anarchic, and as transparent in process as Copenhagen was riven by backroom deals. And rather than inviting world leaders at the end, which paralyzed ministers in 2009, the French brought them in at the beginning to give a boost to the proceedings. But the most significant difference between 2009 and 2015 may be today's global realization, what the French call a prise de conscience, that climate change is a clear and present danger that will get much, much worse very quickly unless we do everything right. Even then, we're counting on nature to restrain its all too obvious capacity to overwhelm our puny efforts. In the end, that may have been the main driver of the Paris Agreement, a gathering sense of fear. In any case, as many have said, it is far too soon to declare victory. To start with, powerful vested interests may have executed a tactical retreat, but they have yet to play their final hand. Oil exporting nations, a fossil fuel industry worth $5 trillion, and the legion of politicians at their beck and call are not likely to go quietly into the night. Quote, "The climate bandwagon is rolling and gathering speed such that the fossil fuel industry will spend the coming years and decades in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons," close quote. Brian Ricketts, Secretary General of the European Association for Coal and Lignite, wrote recently to his members. "This is not a sustainable position, and the industry should no longer acquiesce," he said. These are fighting words. Their influence can be felt in the agreement itself, if only for what is not there. Case in point, Burning fossil fuels is far and away the main cause of global warming. That's a simple fact. To even have a chance of avoiding catastrophic impacts, upward of 80% of known oil, gas, and coal reserves must simply stay in the ground. And yet, not once does the phrase fossil fuel appear in the 32-page text. The same goes for carbon dioxide and CO2. Nor is there any suggestion for creating a carbon tax or removing the $500 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. But the most powerful pushback, of course, will come from the planet itself. There are 195 parties here, 196 with the EU, said Jean-Pascal Ypercel, a Belgian climate scientist and until this year, vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But there is only one party that is not represented, he said, nature. It is a party with whom nobody can negotiate. There were hundreds of scientists at the COP, and many of them sounded alarms as the agreement took shape. While they applauded the ambitious goal of holding back warming to well below 2°C, they decried the lack of a detailed roadmap for cutting greenhouse gases. The IPCC has told us that to have a 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, emissions have to fall 40 to 70% by 2050. To reach the 1.5°C target, those mid-century cuts would have to be even deeper, 70% to 95%. These are dizzyingly difficult goals, which imply a total decarbonization of the world economy within 3 or 4 decades. But without these benchmarks, stripped from an earlier draft, the agreement does not send a clear signal about the level and timing of emissions cuts, warns Stefan Kalbekken, director for the Center of International Climate and Energy Policy in Norway. Boosting the ambition of the temperature target on the one hand, while removing the yardstick against which progress towards that goal could be measured on the other, creates a serious imbalance. One NGO, long before COP21 began, took to talking about the road through Paris rather than the road to Paris. And they are right. The Paris Agreement is critical, but it must be seen as a way station, not a destination. For this segment, we're going to break with tradition, and for the expert interview, I'm going to interview one of my colleagues, Claire Snegeroff, who also covered the COP from beginning to end with me. Claire, you covered 3 climate conferences before the one here in Paris. How did this one compare with the others that you covered?
Outre le fait que celle-là avait une importance sans précédent par rapport aux autres, elle a été, je trouve, beaucoup plus difficile à couvrir pour une raison simple, c'est qu'elle avait été extrêmement bien organisée et qu'elle était très bien maîtrisée par la présidence française. Donc en amont, il y a eu un travail sur les différents pays, etc., pour connaître leur position, leur marge de manœuvre. Et même pendant la COP, un travail d'inclusion de tous les pays qui fait que ce qui aide normalement un journaliste à couvrir la COP, c'est une dramaturgie, des moments de crise, des éclats de voix, les moments où les pays se servent des médias pour faire valoir leur point de vue, faire avancer leur position. Ce qui n'était pas le cas, tout se passait dans le cadre des négociations internes entre la COP, entre la présidence de la COP et les partis. Du coup, une lecture beaucoup plus difficile de la COP. Et donc, je trouvais une couverture, un récit, on va dire, voilà, un récit médiatique de la COP beaucoup plus difficile que les COP précédentes qui avaient été rythmées par ce genre de moments de crise, comme ça, et d'éclats.
Interesting. If you were giving advice to a journalist who's covering one of these things for the first time, what would you say?
Je dirais bien sûr de s'habituer et d'apprendre très vite le jargon. Vocabulaire, parce qu'il s'agit de parler une nouvelle langue, donc il faut en connaître la syntaxe et le lexique. Et puis assez vite aussi de repérer des experts qui pourront appuyer une expertise lors de la COP. D'abord pour avoir une information sur ce qui se passe en coulisses, tout simplement, une source d'information, et puis ensuite des experts qui sont en mesure de décrypter ce qui se passe, même publiquement, pour comprendre les subtilités de ce processus qui est assez compliqué à suivre quand on y arrive pour la première fois.
Following up on that, how do you decide who's a reliable person to go to if you want to get information about a COP? In other words, everybody's coming with their own agenda. How do you choose who to turn to if you need information?
C'est l'expérience, c'est-à-dire qu'on se rend compte assez vite qu'une source qui peut paraître extrêmement fiable, tout simplement, l'expérience montrera si elle l'a été ou pas, et si son point de vue sur les choses a été juste ou pas. Et moi, j'ai déjà abandonné des sources comme ça en cours de COP. Oui.
And finally, a more personal question, if I may. I know from my own experience that one can get very invested in this story because there's so much at stake and because the outcome really does matter. Do you find yourself juggling your own emotions in relation to this story while you're covering it at the same time? Is that an issue for you?
Ça peut l'être, ça dépend du sujet. Effectivement, on peut assez vite lire l'histoire en termes de bons et de mauvais, les bons et les méchants, les gentils et les méchants. Donc après, ça c'est comme dans toute expérience journalistique, c'est un moment où être conscient de son penchant et l'équilibrer. Mais j'avoue que cette COP était un peu particulière en tant que Française. Et j'avoue qu'il y a eu un moment d'émotion qui m'a un peu submergée à la fin quand un de nos experts est rentré dans la pièce pour nous dire « vous pouvez être fiers de votre pays ». Et là, j'ai eu une espèce de gorge qui s'est serrée en me disant « mais effectivement ». Et là, j'étais plus vraiment journaliste, je ne sais pas bien ce que j'étais, mais c'était vraiment un moment émouvant. Et d'ailleurs, tout le moment de l'adoption était un moment particulièrement émouvant, et je pense, en tant que Française en particulier. Voilà, donc c'est ces moments où on peut être un peu dépassé. Il s'agit évidemment de retomber sur ses pieds assez vite.
So, in the aftermath of the COP21, here are a few tips worth remembering. Number one, especially if you're a beat reporter, take the time to cultivate your sources. Not every conversation you have with a source, whether it's someone working at an NGO, a think tank, or a diplomat, has to result immediately in a story. Show your sources that you're interested in hearing what they have to say, and even if it's just to deepen your knowledge and to gain some background information. Taking the time to do that in the long haul will pay off. In a crucial moment when you need to contact a source to get a confirmation on a breaking story, for example, the fact that you've built up that relationship will make a big difference. When you're covering a story like the COP, where there is some sort of master text or document that everybody is focusing on, do your homework. Make sure that you've read it going into the event and that you keep up with modifications as drafts are issued. And especially at that key moment where decisions need to be made about whether or not that version is going to go through, you need to be able to identify quickly what are the key passages, what are the ones that people are focused on, what are the ones that really matter in the end. So take the time to do your homework. Here's a third thing to bear in mind. At a meeting like this, at a critical moment, don't hesitate to doorstep closed-door meetings. It helps to know who you want to talk to as people stream out of them, but you can buttonhole somebody and ask the questions. Make sure you ask clear, simple questions because you're likely only to have a few seconds to ask them. Finally, COPs are unusual in that they really are marathon events. They last at least 10 or 11 days, often 12 or 13. So learn how to pace yourself. I've seen it happen, and it's happened to me. If you burn out too soon, you won't be at your best for the critical moments. Here are a few key points to retain about the COP21. Number one, the COP21 is the first universal climate agreement in which all countries have agreed to make efforts to cut greenhouse gases and subject their efforts to outside scrutiny. Number two, but these carbon-cutting pledges are not good enough to meet the newly ambitious target of holding global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. So the agreement also puts in place a once every 5 years review process to encourage countries to make greater mitigation efforts. Number three, while the Paris Agreement is a diplomatic and political breakthrough, it is not in itself adequate to beat back the threat of global warming. And finally, number four, do not underestimate the scale of the transformation set in motion by the Paris Agreement. It is nothing less than the wholesale replacement of fossil fuels as the source of energy that power human society.